This is a story of an old legend that happened a long time ago on a cold, dark, moonless night with millions and millions of stars in the sky. And in the middle of that night, a young man walked into a village, and it was completely dark. No light shone in any of the houses. And he came up to the first house that he came to, and he knocked on the door. And he cried out, "Please, can you help me? My wife has just had a child, and I'm in need of some coals to start a fire so we can stay warm." But no light turned on, and no door was opened. And so he went to the next house, and the next house, and the next house, and the next, and the next. But never did a light turn on or a door open for him. And finally he came to the last house in the village, and he knocked on the door. But all was quiet in the little village. And so he turned away from the village, and he looked out across the fields and the hills. And way off in the distance, he could see what looked like a fire. And as quickly as he could in the dark, he headed out across the fields toward that fire. And as he approached, he could see that there was a shepherd around the fire, and surrounding the shepherd and the fire were his flock of sheep. And as he got closer, 3 dogs rose out of the darkness and started to bark at him. But even as they started to bark, they found no sound came out. Nevertheless, they ran at the young man, and their nostrils were flaring, and their teeth were barred, gleaming in the light of the fire. And one came at one leg, and one came after the other leg, and the other one came after his arm. And they came up to the young man, and what they found, that they couldn't bite him. Their mouths were stuck open, and they couldn't bite. So finally they gave up, and they whimpered off back into the shadows. Now, the old shepherd was a gnarled old man, and he did nothing to stop his dogs from attacking him. And he looked at this young man as nothing but trouble. What else would he be out here in the middle of the night? The young man came up to the edge of the flock of sheep, and they were sleeping so close together that there was no room to step between them to get any closer. So he called out, "Good shepherd, can you help me?" And the shepherd looked at him with narrow eyes and a cold heart. And the cowl was hiding his face. He just looked at his fire and ignored the young man. And so the young man hopped up onto the backs of the sheep and started walking across the sheep like you would across the rocks in a riverbed. Now this was too much for the old man, and he slowly rose, got to his feet, and he grabbed his staff that was carved to a point at one end like a spear, and he hefted it back, and he threw it directly at the young man. Now he was good at this because he was used to fending off jackals and lions from attacking his sheep. And his aim was true, and he threw that spear, and it was going directly at the young man coming across the back of the sheep. And right before it got to him, it swerved and went off into the night and was gone. And the young man continued walking across the backs of the sheep, completely ignoring the fact that the shepherd was throwing things at him. And he jumped down into the inner circle next to the fire. And he said, "Good shepherd, can you help me? My wife has just had a baby, and we are in a little shed in need of some coals to start a fire to keep warm." And the old shepherd was about to tell him to get lost, but then he noticed the young man had no pail to carry any coals, and he had no shovel to get them out of the fire. So he looked at him and said, "Sure, take all you want." Gratefully, the young man took off his mantle and put it down next to the fire and got down on one knee, and he sunk his hands into the fire, and he took 2 handfuls of hot coals. Don't try this at home. 2 handfuls of hot coals, and he put it into his mantle. And before the shepherd could tell him that surely the coals would burn through his mantle, he had lifted the mantle up by the corners, hopped onto the back of the sheep, and was gone. And the old shepherd thought to himself, the dogs could not bark or bite. The sheep did not wake up when he walked across their back. The coals did not scorch or burn his hands or mantle. This is no night, like any ordinary night. So he called out, "Wait!" But the young man was too far and he couldn't hear him. So the old shepherd gathered up his satchel, put it on his back, and headed off after the young man, following him by the glow of coals in the night. And he walked, following him through the hills, through the field, and saw him, as he approached the town, go into a little shed on the other side of the village. And he walked through the town, came to the shed, and he knocked at the door. And the young man opened the door. And the old shepherd walked inside. And inside he found a young lady seated on a stool next to the newly kindled fire. And next to her was a manger, or feeding trough. And inside the manger was a pile of hay. And on the hay was a little baby. And the old shepherd's heart went out to this little child who was born in such humble and cold circumstances. And he remembered that he had a sheepskin in his satchel. He brought out the sheepskin and he handed it to the young man. And they lifted up the baby and put the sheepskin underneath him and laid him back down. And the baby stirred and woke up. And the old shepherd knelt down next to the manger and looked at this beautiful child. And the baby blinked and moved his head a little. And their eyes met. And the shepherd felt that this little baby was the best and truest friend that he had ever had. And in that breathless moment, the old man and the little baby in that humble stable, in that cold, dark night, gazed into each other's eyes. And the old man felt wave after wave of love coming to him. And somehow he could tell that this little child knew all the meanness in his heart, all the bad things that he had done, all the selfishness he had, and still he felt wave after wave of love washing over him, filling him completely. And after a moment, the little babies blinked and his eyes grew heavy, and he nodded softly back to sleep. And the old man blinked and rubbed his eyes and stood up, and he nodded to the young couple. And he turned to leave, and it was then that he noticed them. Throughout the whole stable, it was filled with beautiful angels. And he walked through the door outside, and the sky and all around the stable were filled with angels. And not only that, but they were singing the most beautiful music that he could ever imagine. And he realized that these angels had been there the whole time. But now he had changed, and he could see them. And he was grateful. And he walked back through the village towards his flock. And a group of shepherds from a nearby field came through the village with torches and wonder in their eyes. And they said, "We saw angels. They said there was a child." And the old shepherd just smiled. He pointed to the little stable. And he walked back through the village, through the cold, dark, moonless night, with millions and millions of stars in the sky. And he walked back to his flock, and he sat down by his fire, and he gazed for a long time at the embers there. And he knew, without a doubt, that he would never be the same again. May the blessings of Christmas fill your heart.